All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to week 5 of Psych 810, Advanced Ed Psych. So I want to give everybody fair warning. I am recording this video from home because Monday apparently decided to be very, very hectic, and I'm recording this right before my virtual office hours. So hopefully this doesn't conflict too much with those. But I will warn everybody that there are 2 children in this house. As I've said before, if you need more evidence, there's one of them right there. We think she's going through a growth spurt, and we're also practicing. We got them an indoor sandbox because we are gluttons for punishment, and we like to hear our son scream when our daughter throws sand in his eye. So, all right, let's get going. So the test is next week. I will open the test on. Honestly, I'll probably open it this weekend, maybe Friday or Saturday. I'm just gonna leave it open through the duration of the week. Okay, so yeah, it should be pretty self-explanatory. 20 questions, no real concerns there. 60 total points. You take it, you'll get it graded immediately. And then there should be, as far as assignments are concerned, you should have no other assignments other than discussions will be due. So no other assignments will be due until March 15th. So you got a good little bit of a break, a few weeks off, and and so there will be a discussion next week. So we're not going to have a chapter video next week, but we will have a discussion due next week. And I'm going to find something hopefully relevant in today's media that can be discussed, okay? So this week we are discussing learners with exceptionalities, and this is a topic that is very near and dear to my own heart because I'm a school psychologist, and I worked much of the work that I did as a school psychologist, 99.9% of the work that I did, was working with special needs populations. And so it's important to consider that learners with exceptionalities is really just an umbrella term that is used to describe students that are sort of on both ends of the spectrum. So if you're imagining a bell curve, you have sort of on the lower end of the curve is your special needs students, the ones that need more accommodations or modifications. The functioning is found to be lower than your typical student, and then on the other end of the spectrum are your gifted and talented students, where they are found to have some kind of cognitive advantage over their peers, and then they are given some kind of extra support to really help them utilize that cognitive advantage as much as possible. Okay, so learners with exceptionalities is really just referring to both of those camps. Your special needs, because ultimately they are both special needs students. One is just requiring more accommodations, more modifications in order for them to access the core curriculum, and then the other group is needing some kind of accommodation or modification in order to sort of go above and beyond and access their full potential, if you will. So psychometric view of intelligence, it's important to consider the different types of intelligences and IQ models because of the fact that in the schools, when it comes to identifying students that have special needs, whether they're in special education or they are in gifted and talented, they all, for the most part, it's really dependent on the state that you live in, but for the most part, most states rely on some sort of IQ test. And the predominant one used in the schools is the psychometric view of intelligence, which is largely based around IQ tests that we give. So as a school psychologist, I would administer a Woodcock-Johnson or a WISC or a KABC, which these are all names for different IQ tests, and then I would, and then an academic assessment would be given, and then those scores would be analyzed and compared to each other, and we would make the determination if an individual qualified for special education or not. There are certain states that have actually gone away from that model. They are only using academic data or response to intervention data, depending on what grade level you're in. So whenever I worked in Denver, the entire state of Colorado is an RTI state. And so whenever I worked in Denver, I was there for about 6 months, and I think I did 5 IQ tests in those 6 months, compared to when I was working in California. In any given semester, I would do 40 or 50 IQ tests. And honestly, I was pretty fortunate. There are some school psychologists out there that will do 75 in any given semester. So it's important to consider just the differences between different states. And one of the main reasons that some states have moved away from that is because response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of support, depending on what you want to call it, it's a little less dependent on culture, right? So there are a lot of asterisks when it comes to how we identify individuals for special education, and one of the big ones is that IQ tests are not always appropriate for all of our students, and they are obviously widely used, and they are very, very common in the schools, but there are many times when the use of these tests might lead to some concerns, right? So like whenever we have students that are very, very young, I think the consensus really is that around 5th grade is whenever we start to see cognitive functioning, or IQ level, I should say, really kind of plateau. But before then, the IQ score has been found to be very, very unreliable. It is still shifting. It is still being fine-tuned. And if we are going to qualify a student for special education in 2nd, 3rd grade, then really you're asking for trouble, because these tests are not widely acknowledged as being reliable at those early ages. Whenever I was working in Las Vegas, I had a school psych that she would do IQ tests with kindergartners, which, I mean, they're made to be used at that point. They are made to be used with kindergartners, depending on what test it is. But you're going into it knowing that the score is unreliable, and that the score will likely change even between this time this year and this time next year. So really, it's something that needs to be considered. And the reason I say it's culture dependent is because the reason it's culture dependent is we have students that are walking into our schools with various levels of functioning, right? Academic functioning, cognitive functioning, whatever it might be. And I know whenever I was working in Compton, I was working in the elementary schools, and they had students that were coming in day 1 of kindergarten who honestly had no real exposure to books. And then they were being asked to complete an IQ test, which makes it really, really difficult for that individual, for that child, and then it makes it really, really difficult for the school psychologist, because I think we all sort of acknowledged that this was a concern, that this shouldn't be done, but what else do we do? Because in California, at least, and in Kansas, we have, and absolutely in Missouri, we have really based our system largely off of this model, okay? And I'm going to get into some of the other concerns when it comes to these scores here in a little while, but for now, the last point I want to point out is IQ is a fantastic metric if it's reliable and if it's useful, but it's also a concerning metric because a lot of times I've had students that have had IQ scores in the lower range, and they graduated from high school and are in college and are doing very well in college. I have had students who have had IQs in the high average to high range. Students that should be qualifying for gifted and talented, and they are struggling through high school. They're going to drop out, and the likelihood of them going to college, at least in the short term, is decreased significantly. All right, so my daughter's very shrieky, so all right, let's keep going. Other types of intelligence that we don't really consider in the schools is emotional. All right, sorry if you noticed a glitch there. I hit pause real quick because both my kids wanted my attention, and so anyway, so some other types of intelligence that we don't really consider in the schools, that I think we should consider in the schools. Emotional intelligence is one huge variable that we don't really consider in the schools. At least most school psychologists, most IEP teams don't necessarily consider emotional intelligence. I always try to consider emotional intelligence whenever I was doing assessments. Sometimes parents appreciated it, sometimes parents hated it, because there were times that I have had situations in the past where a parent wanted their child to qualify for special education, and because of various factors, including emotional intelligence, I thought it would be inappropriate for them to qualify for special education. And I've had it work sort of in the opposite direction, where they did not want their kid to qualify for special education, and because of a lot of factors, one of which being their emotional intelligence, I did qualify them for special education. So, these are very, very interesting and very important to consider as we are working in the schools. And cultural intelligence, that one's pretty hard for us to teach in the schools, especially if you prescribe to the idea that our schools are becoming much more segregated than they were in the past. Obviously, not more than they were in the pre Brown v. Board of Education days, but because of socioeconomic factors, a lot of schools are becoming much more homogenous, and so cultural intelligence becomes more difficult for us to teach, right? And so if my neighborhood school is predominantly minority, predominantly low income, and I'm working there, and there is a parent who is different than the norm of that school, that their child could help essentially teach their peers some level of cultural intelligence, of a culture that is different than their own. But a lot of times parents don't necessarily want their kids going to those schools, and so cultural intelligence becomes very difficult. An interesting video to watch, if any of you are interested, is Google, I think it's Frontline Class Divided, and it's a very, very interesting video. And it's a very interesting video. I will warn you, it has some very sensitive language. There are some words in there that understand that this video was recorded in like 1970 Riceville, I think it's Riceville, Iowa. And so they say words that are no longer considered appropriate in a professional sense, but the spirit of what the video tries to get across is really interesting, in that this teacher, elementary school teacher, she tries to teach her kids a bit of what it is like to be discriminated against, which again is really difficult when it comes to, you have a classroom full of children that are lily white. It makes it pretty difficult for us to teach them what it's like to sort of live a day, be discriminated against like other minority students might be. So what she does is she actually essentially segregates her classes based on eye color. And it was interesting to see how quickly students kind of fell into the into this mode of we don't like them because they have brown eyes, and something as small as that is it's pretty interesting to see. So I think it's worth checking out. Frontline, Class Divided. So a model that is out there that is widely publicized but has very little research support is the theory of multiple intelligences, Gardner's multiple intelligences. Overall, the research out there suggests that his different intelligences, the different categories that he considers each to be a unique intelligence, type of intelligence, is really more of a different categories within one umbrella of intelligence. So for those of you that are not aware, the predominant model of cognitive functioning, cognitive assessment up there is called CHC theory, the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory of cognitive intelligence. And they categorize intelligence as this one letter, G, and within G, there are 20 different sort of sub-intelligences, right? And with these IQ tests that we do our best to assess each one of these variables, each one of these types of intelligence, or each type of cognitive functioning, right? And so ultimately the research that has been done to evaluate Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence really lands on that it is a theory that it is several types of intelligence that are all within the umbrella of G. Okay. Sternberg's view of intelligence is something that I think was pretty interesting, if for no other reason than just the fact that it does focus on how a student functions in the real world and helping, and I think there's a lot of okay, so the reason this is interesting is going back to the point that I was making earlier about having seen individuals with IQs that are very high and they are struggling and they're failing in the high schools, and then I've seen individuals that have IQs that are much lower and they're able to be very successful in the high schools. And so it really is important to just remember, for those of you that are going to be involved in sort of the special education process at all in your schools, that if you are walking into an IEP meeting and you are reading a psych report or a report from any individual that's in that meeting, that they really should consider all these different factors that are not necessarily included in your Woodcock-Johnson or your WISC, but they need to do a really good job of interviewing. Interviews are really, really important. The interviews that we do with our students and with our parents and with our teachers give us a lot of information, right? So a lot of times school psychologists will gloss over interviews, or they'll just use some sort of like generic list, sort of questionnaire for their teachers, and really that's a flawed system. I'm sorry to say it. If you are working with a school psychologist that does this, my concern with that is that a teacher has more knowledge. You as a teacher, most of you are going to be teachers in this room, quote unquote room. You have more knowledge about a child than what you're going to put onto a half sheet of 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, right? So it's important that we're making sure we're doing our interviews and that we're making sure we're doing our due diligence to make sure that we have a full understanding of who this child is and how we can support them. Okay. So ability grouping is a pretty controversial topic. and it has been made illegal, at least tracking in the sense of tracking based on race has been made illegal, but we still have tracking in the schools. It's important to consider that tracking is still taking place depending on what jurisdiction you're in, depending on how competitive the colleges are that you're talking about in your region. You might not necessarily have this so much in Kansas, where the colleges are really begging for students. But I know when I was working in California, a student had to come into high school the first day of their freshman year knowing whether or not they wanted to go to a four-year university. It was not like it was when I grew up in Texas, so it was not California, but whenever I was graduating from high school in Texas, it really was. I had a lot of friends that were able to simply apply to college at the end of their, beginning of their senior year, having not really considered a whole lot about what they wanted to do or if they really wanted to go to college. And so it's really interesting to see that, whenever I was working in the high schools in California, you did have situations where a student, if you wanted to go to a University of California, somewhere in the UC system or in the Cal State system, you had to take 4 years of math, and in order to graduate from high school, you only needed 2 years of math. And so a student could come in, and if they were interested in doing the CTE program, the career technical ed program of auto tech, you could come in, do your 2 years of math, and then never do math again. So the difficult part is you need 4 years of math to go to a four-year university, and you have made the decision essentially middle to end of your sophomore year of high school that you're not going to go to a four-year college. And and some states are seeing this, some other states are seeing this too, depending on sort of the competitiveness of the schools, right? So I don't know that anybody is seeing necessarily to the extent that California is seeing, but I know that the University of Texas and obviously down south in Texas is seeing some similar issues where just they are overly impacted. Everybody in Texas wants to go to the University of Texas, unless you want to go to Texas A&M, and so they are having to institute a higher requirement for students that want to go to that university. And so with that, whenever that happens, you are seeing students that are deciding earlier and earlier that they are not interested in going to college. And the reason that this is a concern to me is because we are, in this day and age, technology is growing so increasingly fast that a lot of jobs are going to be sacrificed to technology, right? So I always give the example of a few years ago, I was in the Jelly Belly jelly bean factory in Fairfield, California, and as we're walking through, there's this massive, massive room where they have these big, honestly, they look kind of like cement mixers, but they're the big vats where they put the jelly beans in, and they're putting sugar on the jelly beans, and they have a robotic arm, about 15, 20 of them, just lifting pallets of jelly beans and big bags of sugar and moving them from one place to the other. And they have about 2 or 3 guys standing there making sure that all the electronics are working just fine, that everything is going just fine. And I mean, rewind 20, 30 years, you probably would have been looking at a room with who knows how many individuals, full-time employees. Okay, so you just rewind 20 years ago, and I'm gonna apologize now if you see any weird glitches. That's usually me hitting pause because one of my kids starts to scream or is coming really close, and I don't necessarily want them being recorded by the camera. But yeah, so all the estimates that are out there are indicating that a large majority of jobs that we currently have are being given away to computers, and that a larger proportion of the jobs that we have out there that are going to be available are going to be high skilled jobs. They're going to require a college degree or a master's degree or whatever it might be. And so I was having this discussion earlier with a student, and we were discussing that trades and vocations are still very important, which I absolutely agree with. You just have to be aware that certain jobs are, honestly, they're going to be temporary. If you are interested in trucking, if you want to be a truck driver, and there is a lot of work by a lot of different companies that are working to put truck drivers out of business, put truck drivers out of jobs, because Tesla is currently working on constantly on increasing the ability to make trucks driverless. Excuse me. And so there are companies out there that have worked to essentially get big rig, big trucks, 18-wheelers, to, a human will drive the truck through the streets of New York City, and when they get to the freeway, they will either get out or they will go and sit in the back of the truck, and then the truck will drive itself to, to sunny California, and will get all the way to San Francisco. And whenever they need to get off the freeway in San Francisco, a human will take over and will drive through the streets of San Francisco, right? Because ultimately, a truck, they argue, can be driven by a computer on I-80. There's no reason that a human has to do that job. These people argue. There are jobs that are likely going to be around for a very long time. Electrician. It's hard for me to imagine a computer, a robot being able to replace, do some electrical work in my house. It is hard for me to imagine a robot repairing an HVAC system in my house or in my attic. But maybe one day these jobs will also be gone to computers. So anyways, ultimately we need to be encouraging as many students as possible to go to college. I understand there's the argument that college is not for all individuals, but in a world where jobs that require some level of cognitive ability and cognitive functioning that a computer cannot have, those are the jobs that we should really be striving to achieve at this point. Okay, so legal framework for exceptional learners is the biggest piece of legislation out there when it comes to special education is IDEA. It was first published in 1975, PL 94142, and this was the first time in the history of United States public education that a school was required to allow a student with a special need, with a disability, to enter their doors. Can't yawn. Anyway, so it was reauthorized as IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, in 2004, and the two biggest aspects of IDEA when it comes to special education is FAPE, which is free and appropriate public education. Excuse me for just saying. All right, free and appropriate public education, which is ideally determined by the assessment that a school psychologist and a special education teacher are conducting, and also LRE, least restrictive environment. Just because a student needs special education and they need an IEP does not necessarily mean that they need to be removed from the general education classroom as a whole. I know that in the schools I worked at in California, if you went to Wilsey Wood High School and you needed math services, then you were going to be in a room that is separated from the general education classroom, which is concerning because these individuals, there's a lot of work to show that the best model for all individuals involved is a well-run universal design or inclusion model, which incorporates all students with special needs and without special needs into a single classroom, because ultimately the quality of the education that is taking place in the general education classroom is at a higher level than the education that is taking place in our special ed classrooms. And I know I'm saying that to a lot of you that are hopeful special education teachers, or maybe your current special education teachers, but ultimately this is more reason for you to remember that the work that you do is incredibly important, and the work that you will be doing to improve the quality of the instruction that you're doing in your classroom is very, very critical. And so, yeah, but ultimately, a universal design, a well-run inclusion model is really, really the best option at this point. All right. And I'm going to pause for a little bit so I can do my online virtual office hours. All right, so if I don't see anybody, then I will be back here in a little bit. All right, bye. Okay, so nobody's logged in yet, so I'm going to go ahead and keep recording the video so we can get this out as soon as possible. I think this is a good time to talk about the discussion that I want to have for this week. And what the discussion I want to have this week is about this concept of encouraging all students to go to college. So I brought this up earlier. I think that it's very important for myself. I believe I'm gonna encourage both my kids to go to college. I know a lot of parents are encouraging their kids to go to college. I know that even in Southeast Kansas, which is more of a little bit more of a working class kind of community, a lot of parents, and I had this corroborated by some of my students earlier today, a lot of parents are strongly encouraging their kids to go to college. But there's always the pushback. There is the pushback of college doesn't make sense for everybody, right? So we sort of live in this world where a college degree is almost becoming sort of a prerequisite for, it's kind of becoming the new, when my grandpa graduated from high school, he didn't have to go to more school. He was able to, go in the military and go get a good job with that degree, with that high school diploma. And now we're living in a world where it's increasingly more common that you need to have some kind of degree from a 4-year college. And so I want to have this discussion about just sort of the changing tides in this country, because it is incredibly expensive to go to college, right? So Pittsburg State is a very, very financially affordable school, which is fantastic. But there are oftentimes, if you're living in the state of California, and I know that my tuition when I was living in California and going to grad school was about $16,000, $17,000 a year in just tuition costs, and that didn't include housing. Housing was incredibly expensive. Cost of living was incredibly expensive. So we have people that are really shelling out a ton of money to go to college, but we are also living in this world where we encourage all of our students to go to college as much as possible. And there's reasons behind that, right? Because we do live in a society that is becoming much, much more skilled. The labor that is needed is much more skilled. So if you think of like school psychology, I would encourage anybody in the world to consider the field of school psychology for their possible career, because of the fact that it pays good, and it also can allow for an amazing level of job security, right? So the National Association of School Psychologists has come out and said we are in a national crisis for school psychologists because of the fact that so we have this increasing level of we're encouraging people to go to college and get a degree, and so we're in a national crisis when it comes to school psychologist shortages because of we're not, honestly, the training programs that are out there, that's me. We're not training enough school psychologists to fill the gap. And then we also have a lot of school psychologists that are retiring. And then also there's the issue of schools are just they're wanting more school psychologists and nationwide. But, go to a high school senior, and I've done this, and I went to a job talk in Columbus, Columbus High School down south of Pittsburgh, and, try to tell them here's this amazing career that you can, do great things with, but you're going to be in school for another 7 years. That's kind of a hard sell, but it is a fantastic career. So that is the discussion I want to have this this week, is sort of the changing tides of education and the educational requirements. So a little more about that. So whenever my grandfather graduated from high school, he went and enlisted in the Air Force. He did his service in the Air Force, and then he immediately went from that job in the Air Force, where he got a little bit of technical experience, and he went and worked for Texas Instruments, where he had a fantastic career. He got a company-sponsored pension. He got health insurance for the rest of his life. He got all these things that were much more common in the 50s, right? But that is much less common today, right? If you work in a high school, I know whenever I worked in a high school, I would have been absolutely flabbergasted, beyond flabbergasted, and I might have quit my job to go work for that job if I had a student that came in to tell me that they had a job, that they were able to buy a house, take care of their family, have a stay-at-home wife with 2 kids at home, and whenever they retired at the age of 60, they were able to live out the rest of their life, the last 25 years of their life, on a pension and health insurance for the rest of their life. Like, that doesn't even exist anymore, really. Let's just be honest. So let's just even say if we had students that had left high school and just came back and said they have a good job, right? Now, obviously, there's asterisks, and that's why I want to have this discussion, okay? So let's have a discussion about that. That's my hope for this week. Discussion about sort of just job roles and the necessity of education in our current job market. All right. Okay, so a little bit about the IEP process. So when it comes to conducting a special education assessment, we need to consider as much data as possible, okay? So whenever I was doing an assessment, the assessment that I would do would always include a few components. A record review, which is essentially looking at all the past data that you have for a student. If they are a middle school 6th grader and they are failing math, why are they failing math? That's what you want to know. Were they failing math last year? Were they failing math the year before? Is there something in their record that would indicate that they failed, that they could possibly fail math? Was there a car accident 2 months ago? Is there something about their record that gives you some indication of lack of success? Interviews with parents, with teachers, with students, depending on the functioning of the student. And again, you're getting at as much information as possible to understand, is there a reason that this student is not succeeding? So, in interviews with the parents, is there a divorce going on at home? Interviews with teachers, has the student seemed a little more depressed or a little more withdrawn than they usually were? Are they doing their work? That's a very common one. So the student is failing their math class, but is that because they just won't do any work? And so, say hi to Melody. And so it's important to consider that when we're doing our assessments, because that's important information to know, right? And and so you can get that information from your parents, hear from your teachers. You can also interview. Like whenever I worked in the high schools, I would regularly interview the students because they could give me the best information on why they weren't being successful in the classroom. Um, and then observe in multiple settings. You're going to want to observe as much as possible. And you're going to want to observe in if they're failing math, you're going to want to observe in their math class, see why they're failing. If they're failing in math, you're going to want to observe in their science class, see why they're not failing science, see why they're not failing English, see what what is going on. Try to get as much information about that as possible. And when you're assessing, you want to assess the different areas: instruction, curriculum, environment, and learner. The acronym is very simple. It is RIOT and ISIL. Say hi to my daughter. Say hi, Melly. Hi. All right. So that is the goal. Is you want to assess your instruction, your curriculum, your environment, and your learner. And then that is as straightforward as can be, as intuitive as can be. The instruction is how good is the instruction taking place in your classroom? How high quality is the information, is the material that is being presented in the classroom? The environment or the curriculum, very similar. So, sorry, instruction is how well are you as a Millie? Ouch. All right, sorry about that. My daughter was very, very happy until she was not. So instruction is how well is the teacher implementing the instruction effectively? Is the instruction that is taking place, is it high quality instruction? Curriculum is the textbook that is being used, is the curriculum that is being implemented in the classroom, is it high quality instruction? Is it high quality curriculum? There are actually, if you go to What Works Clearinghouse and you look at the different math programs, you'll actually find that there are a lot of math programs out there that have very little evidence to support them. And Saxon Math is very, very, at least whenever I was in school, it was very common in the schools. And Saxon Math is one that doesn't have a whole lot of research to support it. The environment. Is there something going on in the environment that explains why a student is struggling in the classroom? Is a student picking on them? Is a student constantly barraging them with verbal attacks or whatever it might be? Is there some kind of outside environment that is impacting their education? And then finally, the learner, which really the learner, that is our IEP process, the assessment that we are conducting in the schools is largely directed at evaluating the learner and figuring out, is there some aspect of the learner that we need to help him, that we need to sort of remediate in there. And so largely, a lot of times when I read psych reports, I will see them do some level of record review, some level of interview. Rarely do I see them interview all the people that I think they need to be interviewing, but maybe one or two observations, and I'll see them test. And I will see them do their best to fully evaluate that learner component. But rarely do I see somebody that is evaluating the instruction, the curriculum, and the environment. Those are three that are not as widely evaluated in our IEP process, okay? So we're sitting at about 45 minutes, so I'm going to speed through this a little bit here at the very end. So these are the 13 different categories of special education that you can qualify under. If you want to look at this, you can pause this right here. The one that I'll discuss in a little bit of detail here is specific learning disability, and the reason for that is because of the fact that that is the most common disability that we see in the schools today. I think like 80% of the students that I worked with in the high schools all qualified under specific learning disability. Another one, at least in the high schools, I saw quite a bit was emotional disturbance. Autism is obviously much more common today than it was 20 years ago. And then speech and language impairment. Ones that you rarely run into orthopedic impairment, I've seen, I think, 2 cases. Traumatic brain injury, I think I've seen 1 or 2 cases. Visual impairment, very few. And then deafness, blindness. Those are the more the low incidence categories that you don't really see as much of. And this is another plug for if any of you want to be a school psychologist one day. If any of you have any experience with these individuals that have an orthopedic impairment, so I'll give you an example. I have a student who she has a cousin that is both deaf and blind, and she has had a lot of really interesting experience. The cousin has it. Okay, so so this student had a cousin that was both deaf and blind, and so she will likely, in her entire career as a school psychologist, if she ends up being a school psychologist, will run into 1, maybe 2 of these individuals. But the amount of support, of very specialized, knowledgeable support that this individual will be able to give to a student and a parent that is impacted by this type of disability will be significantly more effective than what I can give them, because I don't have any experience with that, right? So I don't have any firsthand experience other than a little bit of hands-on experience working at a special needs camp whenever I was in high school. I have very little experience with these individuals, and so I think that it's important to consider, if you have very specialized knowledge and experience, it would never hurt to consider being a school psychologist. So specific learning disability, there are a few models that are used to determine whether or not a student has a specific learning disability. The most common nationwide is what's called a discrepancy model. And essentially what that means is the expectation within the discrepancy model is that the IQ will be up here, and then the achievement score in math or in English, math or reading will be down here. And so if there is that significant discrepancy, then the student will qualify for special education. If that discrepancy does not exist, then they do not qualify. As easy as that. States have slowly been working toward banning the discrepancy model because of reliability issues and validity issues. So really understanding how reliable and how high quality of determinations we can make with the discrepancy model when it comes to a student with a specific learning disability. And as states are realizing that the determinations that we're making using the discrepancy model are not all that great, states are moving more toward a response to intervention model or a PSW model, which is patterns of strengths and weaknesses, which essentially no matter what it comes down to, every model has its pluses and its minuses, right? So I am a big believer in RTI. But that is not to say that RTI is perfect. That is not to say that RTI is even all that fantastic or even all that great when done poorly. It is very easy to implement a really bad RTI model in your schools. And if you're doing that, ultimately the data that you're getting from that RTI, from those interventions and the assessments are garbage. And that's the last thing you want to know about. That's the last thing you want, is to implement this program, implement this whole strategy of response to intervention, and then find out that the interventions that are being implemented aren't any good, or honestly the teacher that is implementing the interventions isn't doing it appropriately or doing it adequately. That can lead to a lot of really significant issues within an RTI model. So ultimately, it is to say, just for this course, they all have their pros, they all have their cons, and so understand that. But those are the three big areas of ways to assess. Overrepresentation, really quick. Overrepresentation, this is an example, this is not reality, but ultimately what that means is if this is your demographic makeup at school A, and you have 80% white students, and then approximately 8 or 9% black students, and then 10 or 11 to 12% Hispanic students in your whole school over here. And then over here you have this is your special education population. Maybe I should do it in red. This is your special education population, where you have 20% of special education is white, and then almost 45% is black, and then what is that? 35% is Hispanic. That is overrepresentation. That is an issue, because then you have a larger number of students over here that are not getting as high quality of instruction as they would be getting if they were still in this general population over here. So that is overrepresentation is another reason to argue for the move toward an all-inclusive model, a universal design model. And then gifted and talented. There is the ultimate goal. The ultimate thing I want to go over now is just the fact that there are some states that are trying to move toward not just considering IQ when it comes to gifted and talented. A lot of schools, you'll be in 3rd or 4th grade and you are being considered for the GATE program or the GT program, depending on what region you're in. You will be given an IQ test. And if you do well, then you get into GATE. If you don't do well, then you are not in GATE. You do not qualify. But there are obviously other areas of performance that you can be very, very gifted in and have average to low average, or maybe even just high average IQ, and those are athletics. So whenever I was working in Denver, they were actually opening up their gifted and talented program to students that were on track to become Division I athletes. If you were very, very if you were incredibly gifted on the sports field, then you could be in gifted and talented. If you were an amazing artist, you could be in gifted and talented. If you were an amazing tuba player, you could be in gifted and talented. So there are efforts out there to try and get away from this model of only IQ counts. Okay, so that is it for this week. We're at about 52 minutes. I hope everybody has a great week. I apologize again for this being late, and I apologize even more for the many disruptions from my children. I hope none of you had an issue with that. But ultimately, I like being at home with my family as much as possible. I hope none of you would fault me for that. If you do, email me. If you did not have an issue, then and you stay quiet, then you will likely see me recording my videos from home again. Ideally, I can get them done earlier in the day, but this Monday was crazy, and I did not get nearly as much. I was not able to get anything done today because of meetings and added classes. So anyways, if you had an issue, email me. I'm always open to discussion. Otherwise, have a great week. Get your discussions done, and enjoy the next week when you don't have a whole lot to do. All right, have a great week. Bye, everybody.